I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do. Nobody saw it coming. Over the next few weeks, people will talk like they did see it coming, but they didn't. Nobody saw the new adaptation of Stephen King's It becoming a major blockbuster. They certainly didn't see it becoming the most profitable horror film in history after only 2 weeks in theaters. Now, hopes were high that it could bring in good revenue after a terrible summer for movies, but expectations were realistic. The week before the movie was released, the box office projections for the opening weekend were $50 to $60 million. If word of mouth was good, they expected $60 to $70 million. When the dust cleared, it made $123 million on its opening weekend. As of September 24th, 2017, it has made $477 million worldwide. In retrospect, it looks like they may have underestimated the word of mouth for the movie, but it wasn't so obvious that the movie would be a hit, because there were a few things going against it. There was the terrible summer box office I mentioned before, but also another big-budget, high-profile Stephen King adaptation, The Dark Tower, flopped just a few months earlier. And the movie itself had a troubled production that dragged over 7 years and went through 3 directors, usually the kiss of death. And it was an R-rated horror movie. Conventional wisdom says that an R rating limits the box office potential of a movie. And yet, it not only broke horror film records, it also broke Deadpool's record for the highest grossing R-rated film of all time. All of that happened for a movie based on a 31-year-old novel that was adapted once before, 27 years ago, as a miniseries. The movie is on its way to becoming a cultural phenomenon if it hasn't made it there already. You can see the signs. Mainstream critics are praising the film. People who normally don't talk about horror movies are talking about this one. Horror fans are already talking about how R-rated horror is back and how good this will be for horror in the future. And there's the requisite backlash from hardcore horror fans who reject movies once they hit a certain level of hype. And right on cue, the director is saying, yeah, it's a horror movie, but it's really much more than that, with all sorts of beautiful emotions. I had no idea they were mutually exclusive. There are even news articles about professional clowns complaining that bookings have plummeted since the movie opened. And then there are the pictures on Instagram and other social media. See, people are tying red balloons to sewer grates and taking pictures of it. It's a visual shorthand for the movie. It's the new horror equivalent of Mr. Spock's hand salute, live long and prosper. The balloon means we all float down here. What is it about this movie that has connected so much with audiences? I decided to ask people on both my personal and my Hellbent for Horror social media pages. The question was simple. Before you saw the film, what made the idea of it so appealing to you? I wanted to find out what people thought were the reasons that anticipation was so strong for this movie. Of course, there's never one reason that things like this happen, and I got many different answers. But the answers I got came from the audience, so they're worth a closer look. Nostalgia was a common answer. There's nostalgia for the book and the miniseries, and just the 1980s as a whole from the older generation. And even though most of the younger generation don't watch old movies or read the old books, they still hear about them. And they heard about how this miniseries scared their parents or their uncles. And that kind of word of mouth makes a movie mythical to those that haven't seen it yet. The success of Netflix Stranger Things may have helped a lot as well. It's ironic because that show is clearly inspired by Stephen King's It. So for once, one hand washes the other. Warner Brothers had a very 21st century problem with a title that was hard to market. Well, why? The title was 2 capital letters, I and T. Back when the book was first published, IT technology and IT careers didn't exist. And that made keyword searches problematic in 2017. so they had to go to more guerrilla-style marketing. Warner Brothers cleverly stole from the marketing playbook of another surprise hit, The Blair Witch Project. The director used his Instagram account to post missing person posters of the main characters from the movie, and those posters took off like wildfire. Warner Brothers also had 2 great teaser trailers, and people recorded themselves on YouTube reacting to the trailers, and that went viral. And then was the whole clown hysteria thing. Last October, there was a countrywide urban legend about clowns driving around in white vans trying to abduct children. And clowns would appear at night and break into people's houses and attack them. Like most urban legends that go national, there were no substantiated accounts. But word spread like wildfire and people believed. One person told me that the police in his part of Pennsylvania put a warning out in the news to be wary of copycat clown killers now that the movie is in theaters. These are all valid points for the success, but I think the one that really resonated with me was this one. My take, it's empowering. At some point in every kid's life, you need to stare down the bully. Here, 7 kids stare down death and win. Then, for good measure, they come back as adults and they do it again. But, says the person who wrote me, it also recognizes that battles can wear you down to the point of suicide, and sometimes the right people lose. Overall, though, it respects childhood and grants power to those who wish to take up the noble and proud cause of the fight against evil. Now, all the other answers recognize the marketing and the event and the cultural mindset that made the movie a blockbuster. But this answer speaks to the story and the themes. It speaks to why the story and themes resonate so deeply within us. And I think it speaks to a key ingredient about the work of Stephen King that gets forgotten. It's the ingredient that gets missed in 90% of the film adaptations of his work. I think it's the ingredient that made King's books massive hits from the very start. And it's the reason I will say that this movie version of It is one of the most faithful adaptations of his work. Stephen King realizes that, good or bad, bully or victim, we all have an it inside of us. And that the evils of supernatural beasts can barely keep pace with the evil that men can do to each other. When we think of a faithful adaptation, we normally think of being faithful to the plot and the big scary moments and what the monster's like. But in all honesty, many of the terrible Stephen King adaptations are faithful to the plot and the big scary moments and what the monster is like. I think that if you only look at plot points and big scary moments and the monster, you're only getting half of what is the key ingredient to a Stephen King story. And that's why so many film adaptations that follow the plot to a T feel miserably flat. They're the Frankenstein monster without the lightning storm. The lightning, the key, is how Stephen King makes you sit with the it that's inside of us all. And how convincing he is when he shows the evil that men do to each other. I started thinking about this after I watched the new version of It. Structurally, the movie isn't faithful to the book. The book takes place in 2 different time periods, and King uses each chapter as a narrative device to switch between those 2 times. It's not only a cool device, but it also keeps the mystery of what's going on longer. The movie is a straight narrative taking place in 1988, which I think is good because you get to connect with the characters through the child actors, and they're very good. However, it might be a letdown for audiences when they don't see those kids in part 2 and they are stuck with the adult versions. Think of your high school class reunions. But the big divergence, which almost sunk the movie for me, was Pennywise himself. In the King novel and in the miniseries, Pennywise looks like your traditional candy-colored clown. He's all smiles, and that bright hair and costume attracts curious children to him. It's what he says that scares you, not what he looks like. It's the contrast between what he looks like and what evil he does that scares you. And that's very important to what King is setting up in his story, because the underlying theme to King's It is that monsters don't always look like monsters. The scariest monsters are the ones that hide as something you can trust. The kids in the Losers Club know to fear the bullies at school, but the real monsters can be a police officer or an abusive father or a mother who lies to control you. But this new Pennywise, he looks like he sleeps in a coal bin and he drools and his face paint makes him look like an abstract pit viper. There is not a kid in his right mind that would go within 100 yards of this fucking clown. Pennywise was so obvious about being something scary that I didn't find him scary at all. But what I did find scary and very unsettling was the real world of the Losers Club. This is where the movie is faithful to the book in the most important way, the way that most film adaptations fail. Because Stephen King shows childhood as relentless and perilous. He shows that children are often helpless and defenseless against what fate has dealt them. Sure, it is relentless because we see children die, but it is more relentless when it shows children enduring a horrible life that they can't escape. King reminds us that children are defenseless against the power of adults. In this world, even the bullies have bullies. But it's not just the true horrors of violence and sexual assault that the kids endure. The real curse in Derry is the loss of hope and empathy, and you see it in the adults. The threat is how the adult life wants to remove the kindness and the spirit of the kids. A scene that hits home with this is when the character Mike helps at his grandfather's farm. His grandfather's a butcher, and he wants Mike to shoot a bolt into a sheep's skull. Mike is too gentle to do it, and his grandfather executes the sheep right in front of the boy. And then he tells Mike that in this world, you either kill the sheep or you are the sheep. Either or, there is no in between. Later, when things look grim, we see Mike shooting a bolt into a sheep's skull, and he does this with emotionless, dead eyes. The most harrowing scenes are when flesh and blood kids threaten flesh and blood kids. But that reality enhances the nightmare sequences when we see the interior fears of the kids manifested externally as monsters. The anxiety between real life and the nightmares are equally matched. They take place in the same location and at the same time. And that may be why It is one of the few King adaptations that is faithful to the spirit and the theme as much as it is to the plot. It is a unique case because the scary thoughts and fears inside the characters' heads literally show up in the real world as plot points and story structure. Other adaptations of Stephen King novels didn't have it so easy. Because the truly engrossing elements of King's novels, the location where the scariest things happen, is inside his characters' heads. You may wonder, why are there so many bad Stephen King movie adaptations? I think it's because, as readers, we are privy to classified information, because so much of what makes the books rich and gripping and disturbing are internal discussions that characters have with themselves. And many times, those internal discussions are carefully detailed observations of a moment that is a big scare or a plot point. Sometimes the entire flavor of a character comes from what they think, not what they do. And that's not easy for films to bring to life. You can't just have a voiceover while a character is deep in thought again and again. Since most Stephen King stories are really plot-heavy, the filmmakers just drop the internal stuff. And in all honesty, it dilutes the impact of the horror every time. Because when we read Pet Sematary, we drown in the grief and guilt of Louis Creed when he sees his son Gage run over by a truck. We get his self-hatred and his self-absorption and his madness for chapters, not just a page or two. In Cujo, we listen to Donna Trenton's self-hatred as she replays every sin she thinks led her and her son to being trapped by a rabid St. Bernard. In The Dead Zone, we learn the depths of loss that John Smith feels after he awakens from a coma, and we know every evil thought of Greg Stilson, from his days as a Bible salesman who kicks a dog to death until he runs for the House of Representatives. In Misery, we hear Paul Sheldon try to keep himself calm and rational at the hands of a crazed superfan, Annie Wilkes. And we also get treated to how a writer escapes reality through the fantasy he writes. I bring all of this up because when I talked about what I thought of it to my producer, who is also my wife, she asked me a simple question. What's my favorite movie made from a Stephen King novel? And for the life of me, I drew a blank. There have been so many bad ones that they took front and center in my head. Every time I'd start thinking one I liked, that Green Goblin 18-wheeler from Maximum Overdrive chased it away. But it made me think about the novels of Stephen King and what I valued about his books. And I realized that when I started making a list of my favorite movie adaptations, not the best, but my favorite ones, they all took the time to examine the it inside of us all. From his very first published novel, Stephen King had a firm grasp of the outsider. And I'm not talking about the rebel outsider. I mean the awkward outsider, the persecuted outsider, the weird outsider, the victim at birth. Carrie White from Carrie, and Arnie Cunningham from Christine, and Harold Lauder from The Stand, and even Annie Wilkes from Misery. Each of these characters was written with a real understanding of the pain of loneliness. Each of them had a specific awkwardness or strangeness that alienated them from others. King didn't sugarcoat what they looked like or how pathetic they could act. And yet, he skillfully made us empathize with people we'd rather not draw similarities to. Another thing that King has a great grasp of is the anger and resentment and spite of bullies, and how those bullies grow into middle-aged people who use anger and resentment and spite in adult ways that are just as brutal as actual physical violence. The run-ins with teenage bullies in his stories feels raw and ugly and as sadistic as real life. And the vindictive revenge of businessmen and jilted lovers and has-been artists has a documentary-level reality to them. That in and of itself is pretty good storytelling. But King also shows how much he really does understand the outsider, because he knows that inside every victimized outsider is an it as monstrous as any bully has. The outsider has the same rage and resentment and spite, but just hasn't had an outlet yet. King recognizes that the battles against the bullies can wear you down to the point of becoming a bully yourself. He realizes that power, even power that you use to defend yourself, can corrupt you and lead you to your doom. A lesser author would make Carrie White or Arnie Cunningham models of wish fulfillment. Instead, he makes them cautionary tales. Now, not every book or every movie on my list has the outsider as the main character. Sometimes the main character is an average guy thrown into extreme circumstances. You know, like there's a vampire that's killing off a small town, or he's locked in a supermarket while monsters devour the world. The monster outside the door is never the only threat. Our average guy also has to deal with the threat of the it on his side of the door too. Or perhaps the it inside himself. Here's my list of my favorite Stephen King adaptations in no particular order. From 1976, Carrie, directed by Brian De Palma. The Story. Carrie White, a shy, friendless teenage girl who is sheltered by her domineering religious mother, unleashes her telekinetic powers after being humiliated by her classmates at her senior prom. Legend has it that Stephen King's wife, Tabitha, rescued the manuscript for Carrie from his office trash can and therefore changed horror history forever. It can be said that Brian De Palma cemented King as a hot writer when his film adaptation of Carrie became a box office hit. It can also be said that, for better and for worse, the box office success for Carrie meant that there would be decades of movies being made of King's novels. Brian De Palma's movie isn't a faithful adaptation. De Palma couldn't stay faithful to the novel's plot structure if he wanted to, because most of the novel's story is told after the fact, through newspaper clippings and letters and diary entries about the disaster and deaths caused by Carrie White. And yet, Brian De Palma used visual images to effectively bring the true essence and the horror and the sorrow of the novel to the movie. This is a case where the movie is faithful to the themes and the spirit of the book, not the plot. One of the big changes in the movie is to Carrie White herself. In the novel, Carrie is fat and pimply and so withdrawn that she's hard to like. In the movie, we get a young and naked Sissy Spacek, so it's not as big of a hurdle to empathize with Carrie. But what Brian De Palma and Sissy Spacek did to bring Carrie to life was extraordinary. We get her inner thoughts and her isolation and her self-hatred and her delusions almost entirely through visual images. De Palma used a distinct lack of reality for most of the film to create a deeply emotional depth that you really feel. He used cold, harsh light and off-center camera framing on Carrie at the start of the movie, and it gives you the feeling of her awkwardness and her isolation. Spacek acts like, and looks like, a frightened rabbit for most of the film. She wins you over with those scared eyes. Later in the film, De Palma uses warm colors and starburst filters and extremely dizzying camera work to convey Carrie's giddiness at finally being accepted at her prom. Her body language changes completely, and she holds herself as a beautiful woman. And then comes the pig's blood. And in the final act of the film, the world is colored by her rage, colored with her rage, and the world literally bursts into flames. The bullies in the movie and in the novel are predominantly teenage girls. The performances in the movie switch between intentionally campy and powerfully realistic, even within the same character. It's another way to show the difference between the real world and how Carrie sees things. Another thing that I find interesting is that the bullies aren't just the popular girls. We see other nerdy and awkward girls joining in the humiliation of Carrie. It's a survival instinct to blend into the pack instead of becoming a target. That's a detail that smacks of a hard and ugly truth that only someone who's been an outsider would ever put in. I consider Carrie to be an excellent adaptation of a Stephen King novel. Oh, and as an extra bonus, it's the movie that introduced the shock jump at the end of horror movies. Blame Brian De Palma. If there's one word that could describe Stephen King's writing, I think prolific would be at the top of the list. King has published 56 novels, 5 nonfiction books, and 200 short stories in 43 years. If there's one word that would never be used to describe Stephen King's writing, that word would be brief. There's a website called novelwordcount.com with a page dedicated to the word count for all of Stephen King's novels. The shortest is a novella called Blockade Billy with 15,917 words. His longest is The Stand at 472,376 words. Most of his books clock in between 150,000 and 200,000 words. In case you were wondering, the average novel runs around 80,000 words. If I have one complaint about Stephen King, it's that his pacing is, shall we say, leisurely. I have been known to yell, "Get on with it," while reading some of his books. Not only does he write long novels, but he also writes some novels with big and overly ambitious ideas. Now, I applaud the man for taking the risks he does, and that risk gave us The Stand. The Stand is a true masterpiece. But, to be honest, books like The Talisman and the Dark Tower series and Desperation and The Regulators leave me cold. Like his word count, King can start going overboard on alternate universes and way too many characters to invest in, and I'm left in the dust. But as grandiose as some of his stories are, he also writes incredibly sparse novels. I think the King stories are meaner and leaner and scarier when he limits himself. When he writes a story with very few characters, very few locations, and just one big scary thing to focus on, he can be sublime. Like Cujo, where 2/3 of the novel takes place in a station wagon with a dead battery that's in the front yard of an empty farmhouse. There are 2 people in the car, a boy who's having seizures and his mother. The only other character is a rabid St. Bernard who's trying to break in. Oh, and the family has no water in the car, and there's a heat wave. It's a riveting novel, and I highly recommend it. The movie, not so much. Gerald's Game is another great novel with a seriously stripped-down premise. It's a story of a married couple that decides to spend a naughty weekend at the remote cabin by the lake. The husband handcuffs his wife to the bed, but he has a heart attack and dies. The front door of the cabin was left open, and there's a hungry stray dog sniffing around, slowly getting more aggressive. And she realizes that no help is coming. And when she does that, the voices in her head start to take over. It's an amazing and riveting book that is a high watermark by making you fully empathize with the character, warts and all. And then there's Misery. I consider it his masterpiece of compact, focused writing. Now, the 1990 film version of Misery, directed by Rob Reiner, isn't perfect, but it captures a lot of what I think makes the novel so amazing and, in some ways, might improve on parts of it. The story. After a famous author is rescued from a car crash by a fan of his novels, he comes to realize that the care he is receiving is only the beginning of a nightmare of captivity and abuse. What I say about the movie is that it's a softcore version of the book, because the book is probably the most sadistic and emotionally perverse story that Stephen King has ever written. If they made the movie as hardcore as the novel was, it would have closed on the first weekend. In Misery, there are no supernatural monsters to hide the vicious evil that we can do to each other. We see the naked indulgence of brutality when there's nobody to hold you accountable. In Misery, we see that any one of us, even as adults, can be thrown back into the relentless and hopeless child world of it. It shows how once we label people, even if it's a positive label, they fail to be human beings anymore. And then it's no big deal to have power over them. Hell, you might even feel what you do to them is for their own good. Now, the trick of the story is that both characters are guilty of not seeing the other person as a human being. The writer, Paul Sheldon, has labeled Annie long before he's even ever met her. She's a fan. She's in a different class. She's an amalgam, just the face of every fan he's tired of meeting. And yet, this is a lot like an abusive romantic relationship, because Annie and Paul have a perverse symbiotic dependence upon each other. They both desperately need each other, and they resent each other for that. So of course they want to kill each other. Now, I must say that I prefer the truly sadistic physical and mental cruelty of the book. Annie doesn't stop taking mementos at Paul's foot, which she amputates in the book. She mutilates him more. She takes more from him to force him to do what she wants, to force him to do what he secretly wants to do too. But I will say that the movie version of Annie Wilkes is better and more believable than the novel's version. In the book, Annie is not subtle, and we know she is dangerous and insane immediately. But in the movie, Kathy Bates makes Annie goofy and frumpy and funny in a very unsettling way. The way she looks and talks makes it seem like she's dim. But that hides a mind so paranoid and devious you never see her violence coming. She's cloying and goofy right up to the moment she swings a sledgehammer to shatter James Caan's ankles. In a way, Annie Wilkes is a Pennywise for adults. Rob Reiner was smart to keep the camera unobtrusive and invisible and just let the actors crackle away at each other. His comic timing helps the movie lull you into a false sense of security at first, and then once you get used to that, he uses the comic timing to cause anxiety. And Kathy Bates deserved an Oscar because she's the secret weapon that makes this movie faithful to the spirit of the book. As much of a demon that Annie Wilkes can be, Stephen King still made us empathize with the pain of loneliness and mental illness. Misery is a rare time that a little Hollywood polish helped the story find its soul. And since we're talking Rob Reiner, I need to give props to Stand By Me. I know, it's not a horror movie, but for all the humor and nostalgia that made that film a hit, the thing that sticks with you is Kiefer Sutherland and the bullies. Those scenes are so present and so real and so tense that the rest of the movie falls away. And if you look between the rose-colored lenses, you see a world full of sorrow and danger and lost hope that would make these boys honorary members of the Losers Club. Speaking of bullies, that takes me to the next movie adaptation that is a favorite of mine. It's John Carpenter's adaptation of Christine from 1983. I know, I can hear some of you groaning from here. When people who are Carpenter fans rank his movies, Christine usually falls into the lower half of the list. When people who are Stephen King fans rank his books, Christine usually falls in the lower half of the list. But I think it's a misunderstood gem, both as a novel and as a movie. The story. A nerdish boy buys a strange car with an evil mind of its own, and his nature starts to change to reflect it. For a lot of people who read the book and saw the movie, the premise was a little too goofy, obvious, plain. There had been killer cars and demonic cars before, but this was different because this is about an alienated teenage boy who is persecuted by bullies and his overprotective parents, and this is about his attachment to his first car. Now, America is a car culture. What is it that the automobile represents to us? What are the salesmen always selling to us? Freedom. They sell us freedom. As a teenage boy, it's a freedom that has a scent of danger. Society tells you that you're not mature enough to handle this freedom until you're 16. And even then, not everyone can handle the responsibilities of that level of freedom. And people die. Now, I will say that I was a teenage boy with my own clunker of a first car that I was constantly trying to keep running when I read Christine. It may have been why I was initially interested in the book, but it's not why I kept reading the book, or why I value it so highly. In all honesty, the supernatural stuff could have floated away, and I wouldn't have minded. The thing that kept me reading was that Christine may be the most truthful and honest and authentic portrayal of the pain of being a teenager that I've ever read, especially a teenage boy who's an outcast. King captures the way everyone treats Arnie Cunningham differently because of how he presents himself. He resigns himself to the lower end of the pecking order just by how he walks. It's like everyone instinctively knows they can cross lines of respect with him, to treat him as a lower mortal. Even the adults and his parents do it. It's almost like the adults take out the resentment they have for strong-willed kids on the weak ones who won't fight back. And then there's the teenage bullies. Christine has some of the most realized bullies that King has ever written. What I've always liked about King is that he isn't afraid to get dirty when he talks of the outright sadism or the vaguely sexual nature of predators. This isn't about punching or even stabbing. A bully grabs you by the balls from behind while he's whispering faggot in your ear. There are threats of forcing Arnie to perform oral sex. And while the bullies vandalize Arnie's beloved car, one of them takes a shit on the dashboard just for good measure. When you have that much oppression in your life, a friend is the most valuable thing in the world. And Stephen King shows you how devastating it is when that friend, that life raft, drifts away. In the movie, John Carpenter strips the supernatural element in the book down to bare metal, which was a complaint that fans had about the adaptation. But Carpenter pumps up the symbol of a car as freedom and power, and he makes the transformation of Arnie from a repressed loser into a bully the central focus of the film. Because Arnie, like Carrie White, is terribly repressed. And when he gets the power he didn't have before, he doesn't have the tools to stop from going to the other end of the spectrum. Carpenter makes it visually obvious that Arnie has the same kind of it inside him that his bullies do. The scenes that resonate with me and Christine are the confrontations with the bullies in school, but also the quiet talks between Arnie and his friend Dennis Gilder. There's a sadness in the way those conversations change as Arnie transforms. Another standout is when Arnie lashes out at his father once he has transformed. It's remarkable because up to that scene, the parents were shrill and cartoonish. But in that scene, there's no wish fulfillment cheering for Arnie from the audience. There is true horror on the faces of the parents and true sadism in Arnie's. The scene comes right after one of the most chilling lines in the film from Arnie. Has it ever occurred to you that part of being a parent is trying to kill your kids? And then there's the creme de la creme shot of Christine herself rolling down the road, covered in flames. Arnie's power and his rage is now out of control. My God, it's Carrie White's Prom all over again. I recommend Christine because it is faithful to the true and painful and dark heart at the center of the book. Sometimes the best Stephen King adaptations come from the slimmest of stories. The next movie was based on a 134-page novella that was in a collection called Skeleton Crew. It is also the best Stephen King adaptation ever made, hands down. It is The Mist, directed by Frank Darabont from 2007. The story. A freak storm unleashes a species of bloodthirsty creatures on a small town where a small band of citizens hole up in a supermarket and fight for their lives. This movie is more than faithful to the spirit of the novella. It is faithful to every Stephen King story and theme that came before it. Darabont is clearly a student and a fan of King's writing. Now, The Mist isn't his first rodeo with a King story. He also directed The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile. Both of those movies were garnished with Oscars. The Mist is greater than both of them. Just like the other movies, The Mist isn't a carbon copy of the source book, but the changes are more about characters. It's the fleshing out of motivations. And that fleshing out of the characters allows a clever weaving of King's recurring themes in many of his books to enhance The Mist. The danger of a pack mentality, the danger of overheated masculinity, the fragility of an outsider, and the labeling of others to make them lesser beings. And, most importantly, that in the long fight against evil, the good guy doesn't always win. I feel it is wrong to go into more detail about the movie version of The Mist. If you haven't seen it, I strongly encourage you to do so. If you have seen it, you understand how the element of emotional surprise that runs throughout the film is best left unmentioned. Suffice to say, the acting is great, and the characters are so convincing and real that every emotional surprise leaves you drained. And Frank Darabont was so determined in his final vision for this movie and his loyalty to the spirit of the novella that he left a bigger budget at Paramount to make this film right. He teamed with Dimension Films at a much lower budget on the provision that he would have final cut and they wouldn't touch a frame. When you get to the end credits of The Mist, you will understand how brave and beautiful his convictions were. I'll be damned if I'll give anything away. So those are the films that are my favorite adaptations of the works of Stephen King. I also give an honorable mention to David Cronenberg's adaptation of The Dead Zone from 1983 because, well, Christopher Walken. Back to my question I posed to my social media friends. Before you saw the film, what made the idea of it so appealing to you? It's interesting that in all the comments I received, the name Stephen King rarely came up. As weird as it might be to say, he's easy to neglect, to forget about. He's been so much of a part of the fabric of modern horror for over the last 40 years that he's almost seamlessly invisible to us. But I get it. When you think of Disneyland, you think of Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and Snow White. You don't think of Walt Disney. And yet, Disney's creations are the fabric of the popular culture. If you were a teenager in the 1980s and you were into horror, chances are that Stephen King was responsible for your growth as a fan. He is most certainly responsible for the resurgence of horror into the mainstream during that time. Nobody has had as much output or as much notoriety or cast as big of a shadow over the last 40 years in horror as Stephen King has. But when you're that big, I guess it's easy to forget you're still there. I guess it's tough to be the king. And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/hellbentforhorror, and my Twitter handle is hellbenthorror. You can find Hellbent for Horror on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher, and other podcast platforms. And H4H has its own app. You can download it from the Google or Amazon store for Android, and the iPhone version is available on the iTunes store. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay hellbent.